All right. Welcome, everyone, to the student presentations in the course Cybersecurity and International Relations at Brown University on March 11th, 2014. My name is John Savage, and I know you know that, but the audience doesn't, and I teach this course. Today, students are holding mock press conferences on 5 themes: the Morris Worm, the WikiLeaks Cablegate, the Aaron Swartz case, the SOPA and PIPA controversy, and the Snowden revelations. In each instance, teams will speak for and against the issue. And I give you Sam Hoffman. Sir, your team is up.
All right, sir. Let's do it. You're going first. Are you saying anything, or I was going to say so? All right. So what are you doing up here? Everyone's just standing up here? All right, Oliver, you want to start us off?
You got to hold this.
I'm going to do the technical stuff, so you want to do the legal stuff?
No.
We need someone to introduce it, so you introduce it. And then who's it?
So I'll just wave my hand up.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, good morning. My name is Stephen Fabrizio. I am General Counsel to the Motion Pictures Association of America, and we are here to talk about the valuable legislation that Congress put forth in this last Congress, SOPA and PIPA, to combat piracy over the internet. It's a vital piece of legislation, foremost to resolve the jurisdictional question. Courts need to be empowered clearly by the legislature in order to grant injunctive relief against a certain domain name. And SOPA and PIPA does this by empowering the Attorney General and also qualifying plaintiff private actors to submit an application for injunction to a court based on a domain name that is dedicated to infringing activities in the case of PIPA, or in the case of SOPA, is dedicated to the theft of U.S. property. There are considerable differences between these two pieces of legislation. As a general matter, SOPA is considerably broader. Its definition of a website dedicated to the theft of U.S. property is substantially broader than one dedicated to infringing activities. In addition, while SOPA is more limited to civil remedies, or PIPA rather, Title II of SOPA pretty dramatically expands criminal penalties for certain internet activity in violation of copyright law. Third, SOPA increases the categories of entities to which courts can grant injunctive relief to include internet service providers and search engines. And finally, the scope of qualifying plaintiffs, private actors' right of action is substantially broader in SOPA than PIPA. To answer some criticisms about SOPA and PIPA, it would not enact broad censorship powers, as some critics assert. Injunctive relief has long been regarded as a constitutionally adequate mechanism to deter and prevent and stop violations of intellectual property. Concerns about DNS filtering breaking the internet are similarly unfounded. While they may be inconvenient for those companies that do have the technical means to respond without sustaining an unreasonable economic burden, this is not to say that it would break the internet.
Hello, everyone. I'm John McCoskey. I'm the Chief Technical Officer of the Motion Picture Association of America, and I'm going to touch on some of the technical aspects of the law. So, as Dan said, the law basically allows the Attorney General to issue a court order to various internet companies if they're involved with facilitating pirated content. And it depends on what the internet company is. So in the case of an internet service provider such as Verizon or Comcast, that internet service provider would have to place the website with copyrighted content on a DNS blacklist. And DNS is the system across the internet that translates domain names into IP addresses. So when you put in google.com into your web browser, it's probably contacting your ISP's DNS server, which then looks up the appropriate IP address. And so basically, there's all types of remedies that the court order asks companies to do. One is simply removing hyperlinks to sites that produce this illegal copyrighted content that is illegal to distribute. Another way is advertising companies can't run ads on sites that put out illegal content, and search engines would have to remove hyperlinks to those websites. And a lot of technical people assert that this would break the internet, and that's unfounded because the criticism rests mostly on the fact that it could compromise something called DNSSEC, which is DNS security extensions, and it would compromise that DNSSEC for those sites that are targeted. But since the point of the law is to censor those sites anyway, it doesn't seem to be a problem that those sites would be inaccessible in a secure way. And finally, there's a lot of criticism about, well, this would be burdensome to companies who have to remove all their hyperlinks and have to adjust lots of things. And that's true, but something being a burden doesn't amount to it breaking the internet or changing the internet to be
1 to 2 minutes left.
impossible to use.
You guys are at,
Another complaint people make is that this would stifle innovation on the internet. So companies have to worry about whether they're complying with copyright laws and whether the Justice Department would go after them for linking to pirated content. And I don't think this is much of a problem because if you're a new company, you just don't distribute pirated content. And it's more of a problem for existing companies that are really large. But as far as the creation of new companies, I don't think it would stifle new companies coming into the tech industry.
And because you can establish, well, I was supposed to hold this the whole time, my bad. Because you can establish an affirmative defense in court against injunctive relief by showing that you don't have the technical means to comply without sustaining an unreasonable economic burden, that does in fact mean that this would largely be confined to larger corporations who do in fact possess the capability to do this DNS filtering without breaking the internet. That's it.
any final thoughts? 10 seconds left?
Any questions? Are we supposed to take questions now?
Yeah, now it's time for questions. Anyone from any team can ask questions.
Ben.
Hey, so if if you say that the recourse of, companies perhaps not having enough of financial or technical resources to enact this DNS filtering is, expensive court cases, isn't there a risk that, you're going to be that the way you're going to be stifling innovation is by forcing small companies to go against big time, you guys as lawyers, you guys specifically, without the available legal resources that many small companies do not have?
I think there are large costs to legal battles, but that's no different than in the brick and mortar world when you open up a business and you're also possibly subject to copyright laws. So I don't think the internet is a license to lower legal costs, that they should play by the same rules that regular brick and mortar businesses do. Peter.
On that note, why should the plaintiffs not be required to play by the same rules that they do in the real world, and why should it be dramatically easier, and why should the standard be dramatically lower to file a complaint?
Could you speak with some specificity about the standard you're referencing? Because could you speak with some more specificity about the standard that you're referencing? Because
the fact that companies like search engines and hosting providers can be required to take action against a site without a court order.
right, under I don't believe that's the case under PIPA, but I do believe it's the case under the most recent version of SOPA. But I don't think that I think that in order to, when you're talking about contesting the court order, I believe you said it's not the same standards or procedures. I think you got to distinguish the in rem action as opposed to the defending action. And in terms of the defending action, it very much does follow the same standards and procedures as, for example, the federal rules of evidence prescribe. So I think in that sense, it's not distinguishable. I mean, it is distinguishable, those two totally different types of actions, the affirmative action versus the defending action.
Also, I think it makes sense to have a lower bar for filing complaints on the internet because it's so much harder to keep track of copyright violations on the internet, as opposed to brick and mortar businesses that exist. We know that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act hasn't really stopped internet pirating, so perhaps a lower standard will help content protect it.
A standard lower than that of the DMCA, where the standard is I said so?
Well, it's not just you say so. The Attorney General also has to agree with it and then file action. So yes, theoretically a business could file a complaint with the Justice Department, but they don't have final say over where it goes.
Under the DMCA, you can send a request directly to a hosting provider and demand that a site be taken offline because of copyright infringing material, and that site then has recourse to go take it to court or something like that. But if the site can't afford to do that, they have no recourse.
I think that's unfortunate, but I'm not here to defend the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. This law is better than that.
But doesn't it suffer from the same problems with defendants not being able to afford to defend themselves?
I think that's a problem in any legal situation. I mean, there are plenty of possible lawsuits you could send to someone and he wouldn't have the ability to defend it as he would like.
Great, okay, wrap up your thoughts. Good job, guys. Can we get the EFF plus ACLU? Get us all nice and
Should we just switch off at the podium?
Yeah, a little bit of prep.
Should we just switch off at the podium and just have this here?
Sounds good. You want to go through our names?
Yeah, let's do that.
Start right to left on the names.
Sure. Should we just talk? Probably wait until like. I don't know how to check to see if it's on. Hello? Hello? It's greenish. Oh, no, it's on. Hello? If it's red, is that off or? Hello? It's usually supposed to be green. Is the on button over there? Yeah, okay. And it's on. Oh, it is on? Okay.
It is on. It's on.
Okay. One of them. Okay, good.
Shankar Narayan, Legislative Director, ACLU. Michael McLeodball, MICHAEL, MACLEOD-BALL, Chief of Staff, ACLU.
Emily Tynes, EMILYTYNES, Communications Director with the ACLU.
Seth Schern, SETH-SCHOEN, Senior Staff Technologist at the EFF.
McKinley Bear, McKinleyBear, Associate with the EFF.
On October 26, 2011, the House of Representatives introduced the Stop Online Piracy Act, known as SOPA, and on May 12, 2011, the Senate introduced the Preventing Real Online Threats to Economic Creativity and Theft of Intellectual Property Act, known as PIPA. Both SOPA and PIPA were created in order to combat online piracy and improve the economy of the industries affected by it. While the goals are noble, as written, SOPA and PIPA will be ineffective and have widespread detrimental impacts. The only choice we have is to not pass either of these bills. The bill's impact will be analyzed in three realms. First, the bill's potential for infringement upon free speech. Second, the economic impact. And third, the technical problems that it will cause in the domain naming system known as the DNS. First, the bill's potential for infringement upon free speech. While the exact provisions to be in violation of SOPA and PIPA are slightly different, they both come down to similar principles. Namely, if your website or service is found to be dedicated to or facilitating infringing activity, you can be punished. The problem lies not in the fact that infringing content is being blocked, but that the entire website is blocked, even content that is entirely non-illicit. Freedom to publish completely legal information needs to be protected under the First Amendment, and SOPA and PIPA prevent just that. On top of this, ad providers and payment services can be forbidden from doing business with the website blocking the activity for the site to remain profitable and stifling its ability to grow. By blocking entire web domains due to illicit activity on any part of the website, SOPA and PIPA would inhibit the presentation of information, thereby violating the First Amendment and threatening businesses that rely on the free flow of information, specifically search engines, social networking sites, and cloud computing platforms.
So I'm here to talk about the economic impact. So SOPA and PIPA will harm businesses. At the entry level, it'll be harder for tech companies and startups to innovate and grow. While it may seem that the bill to protect intellectual property will protect the content that startups will create, in reality, it will impact the opposite. By requiring the company to take responsibility for all user-made content of the website or face being shut down, they will have to spend more resources on policing, litigations, and lawyers. This directly takes away from the funds to put back into the company to help it grow and innovate. Additionally, the risk of being shut down by SOPA and PIPA will make it more difficult to obtain funding. Venture capitalist groups will not be working to back groups whose direction could be in violation of SOPA and PIPA, even when the spirit of the organization is not directly contributing to piracy activities. For the US, the problem is computed by the fact that many of the startups that might have flourished, creating jobs and innovating domestically, will simply operate outside the US, where copyright laws may be more favorable and the company will face less risk overall.
Thirdly, the technical implementation is both dangerous and ineffective. Censoring of an internet service by removal of its associated domain name is ineffective for two main reasons. First, the approach amounts to combating a drug smuggling operation by taking down street signs around the area in which members are thought to be planning a meeting. The DNS infrastructure provides nothing more than a convenient way to attach a name to an internet address. It is straightforward to change the name when the original one is compromised in some fashion, as has been demonstrated by the largely uninterrupted operation of the Pirate Bay, despite several changes of domain name in recent months. Second, there is nothing in particular that binds the internet to the current domain name system. Although the so-called DNS route is critical to the operation of the system, the route which is currently in operation is not special in any way. It is both technically possible and practically feasible for a motivated group of people to establish and make use of their own parallel DNS infrastructure, with a route totally independent and outside of the control of the current one. If such a system were to be established in order to evade the restrictions put in place by a law such as SOPA or PIPA, it would presumably be established in one of the many known safe harbors for internet services wishing to avoid the reach of the US government. Both of these approaches, described thus far, bypassing the domain name hijacking mandated by these laws, is trivial to implement, minimal effort solution which is both effective and convenient. Not only is it ineffective, it is also dangerous to cyber safety. The DNS redirection measures proposed by these bills not only damage the integrity of the internet infrastructure, but also make it impossible important enhancements to the stability and security of the internet. The domain name system relies on each name having an authoritative owner with the privilege to determine the manner in which the name should resolve. Under the basic system, there exists no way in which it is possible to verify the correctness of the answer received to a DNS query. However, a system called DNSSEC is currently being deployed to address this problem. Under DNSSEC, all DNS records are cryptographically signed by their owners to prove they were in fact issued by the owner of the domain name. This DNS-based takedown mechanism proposed is incompatible with this system because it requires that a party other than the rightful owner have the ability to modify the records associated with a domain name. It is short-sighted and irresponsible to write into law policies which prohibit obvious and necessary improvements to the security and robustness of critical communications infrastructure. For all of these reasons and more, we cannot pass SOPA and PIPA. We are now open for questions from the audience.
So you spoke a lot about the economic impact on new startups of the law, that fewer would start and they'd be less successful. But what about the economic impact onto, say, movie producers and song producers who won't produce their content for fear of it being stolen?
Well, I think we can see that we've had copyright laws in place, similar things, and it's happening now where you're saying that all of your things are being stolen. And look at you guys, you're still producing vast quantities of music and movies all over the place, so I don't think it's actually stifling that area.
Let's say we would be producing more.
I mean, why? Like,
Well, consider the fact that the recording artists, the value of that industry has declined pretty precipitously over the past few years.
I mean, but it's
in no small part due to circumvention of copyright laws, and these sorts of industries, in fact, account for over 6% of American GDP.
I mean, where's the reasoning? Where's the evidence says that it's the piracy that's going on the internet specifically that's causing any of this? Just because just because this happens and then there's a decrease, it doesn't mean that one thing's caused by the other. Because it could easily just be the movies or the music is not up to par as what it used to be.
Well, then how could you argue that SOPA and PIPA would decrease entrepreneurship?
Because if we looked at what we actually say, it's a lot of the reasons because venture capitalists don't want to back these groups for fear that the organization will essentially get shut down completely, and then they'll lose all the money that they put into the investment.
There have been studies and polls have been done of venture capitalist groups in which something like 70% of respondents did declare that if such legislation as SOPA and PIPA were to be put into place, then these people would not actually be willing to invest in specific web startups. So there is concrete information to justify our perspective.
Let's go back here.
Do we know why they're not willing to start to create these startups? Is it because they have pirated
they become a risky investment if there's the possibility, if you have a startup that relies on a lot of user-submitted content and, your end users could submit something that is technically an infringement of copyright, and you as the company, that's not your fault, but the fact that these legislations make it possible that if that were to happen, your entire site could be shut down, that makes the investment by the venture capitalists scarier.
You spoke about the prospect of expressive activity protected by the First Amendment being unduly restricted by SOPA and PIPA. But in the case of PIPA, I would say, this is antecedent on a court finding probable cause that a website has no significant purpose other than engaging in infringing activities. So, supported by that probable cause finding, it means that, the absolute amount of truly protected, non-infringing activities on these sorts of websites that would be subject to injunctive relief, why is that small infringement on the First Amendment not justified by the substantial benefit that would be gained?
The chief issue on the free speech front with this legislation is the anti-circumvention measures that they provide. In addition to providing mechanisms to take down so-called infringing content and things like that, they also provide some extreme penalties to websites which are claimed to support circumvention of these measures. Basically, this is incredibly vague and can be interpreted as largely anything that can help you conceal anything on the internet, which is critical to, say, dissidents or protesters in a country that are trying to organize without letting an oppressive government know what they're doing, anything like that.
All right, guys, we gotta wrap up. Thank you. Great job. Cablegate, U.S. Department of Safety.
Okay, so which one of you guys wants to be Harold Cohen? Which one wants to be Philip Goldberg?
I'll be Philip Goldberg because she's the CS.
Okay.
I'll be Harold Cohen.
Okay, cool. So I'll read the press thing, then I'll give it to you guys for the technical report.
Okay, cool. And then I guess we all just share answering questions.
How much of the technical report do we say?
I think
I'm not gonna
I would just explain the technical inadequacies of the system, and maybe I have in our FAQ the aspects of what we're doing to address it, and I can talk about that if you want. I can just open up the FAQ and go to it quickly, and it's pretty simple. I think I'm just going to say specific passwords, put in a system to monitor data. I'm William Burns, Deputy Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm obviously Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. I apologize I'm not dressed for a press briefing. I wasn't expecting to have to come into work today. Bill and I had tickets to see Willie Nelson at the Kennedy Center, but this took precedence, obviously. So I'm going to read a quick statement about the leaks that happened yesterday. And I'm going to turn over to our Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research and our legal advisor. Yesterday, WikiLeaks released the full cache of diplomatic cables previously leaked by Army Private First Class Bradley Manning in 2010. This is in violation of a prior agreement with media agencies to release the cables in limited redacted form. The State Department strongly condemns this release of classified material on the grounds that it violates the prior agreement to disseminate the cables in a responsible way and puts American lives in danger. The United States government reserves the right, as it always has and always will, to confidential communication. Private First Class Manning and WikiLeaks have taken it upon themselves, undemocratically, to strip the U.S. government of that right, deciding instead that every cable sent by the U.S. State Department, by every U.S. State Department official, should now be available not only for anyone in the USA, but in the world to read. The dissemination of these cables, dealing as they do with sensitive matters of national security and with activities of U.S. government agents, must necessarily be restricted to ensure the safety of these agents and to maintain the trust between our agents and their partners in diplomacy. Furthermore, many of those named in the leaked cables are engaged in important humanitarian and journalistic efforts and may find themselves endangered as a result of these leaks. Private First Class Manning was given access to these cables as part of a larger initiative to make sure that that important intelligence information was made available where it was most needed, at the ground level for regular troops. Unfortunately, this blatant breach of trust between a soldier and his commanding officer forces the Department of Defense to reconsider this policy, seeing as it has paradoxically endangered U.S. troops rather than protect them. Though the State Department has acted under the assumption that the full cables would one day be leaked, we urge WikiLeaks in the strongest terms to take the unredacted files down from their servers as we work to minimize the damage done by these leaks. We stand together with the media organizations responsible for the publication of the initial redacted cables and condemning this reckless act of irresponsibility. State Department officials continue to comb through the cables for particularly sensitive information and to warn those who might be affected by these new leaks. I now turn over to Philip Goldberg, our Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research.
Private Bradley Manning, he had access to the a database called the NetCentric Diplomacy database, and using Lady Gaga CDs and USB drives, he was able to take lots of information off the server and then give it to WikiLeaks. The database was very poorly organized. For example, people did not have individual passwords, and the government had no way of telling whether large amounts of data were being taken off the server and, furthermore, who was doing it.
Hello, I'm Deputy Secretary of State William Burns. I was going to talk briefly about the policies we're going to be enacting in order to prevent something from this happening again. As we've said, issues that allowed for this large downloading of large quantities of data are going to be addressed. We are going to be implementing systems that allow us to determine if large quantities of data are being downloaded in an unauthorized manner. We're going to be implementing unique passwords for each individual who has access to the database so we can track who is doing what, and we will be ensuring that more oversight and checks and balances are being initiated for each individual analyst by making them work together and monitoring each other's activity.
Okay. Hi, I'm Michael Coe, the legal advisor for the Department of State. There are some issues that are raised about United States policy regarding one of our constitutional rights of freedom of the press. We have actually debated on this issue, and we've come to the conclusion that security of our personnel's lives are more important, and that releasing information to a certain extent is what is needed. Discretion is needed when referring to these cable gates, and cable gates do not practice discretion. They put in danger several of our personnel's lives, and also endangered our international prestige, and also endangered our diplomats and diplomatic relations. So we now open the floor up for questions.
Okay, back there.
Yeah, we're from WikiLeaks. Why is it the responsibility of the media to protect state secrets?
I feel like I could turn that around on you. Why is it your responsibility to make sure that state secrets are open to everybody? I mean, who elected WikiLeaks to decide what should and shouldn't be confidential? State secrets, it's not just we're dangling these above you saying, haha, you can't see this. We're doing that because there's a reason this information has to be confidential. If it's a state secret dealing with troop movements or codes we're using or Taliban informants, I think there's a very compelling case to be made that those should remain secret if we decide that they should be secret. Sure, back there.
Going off of your response, in the Supreme Court's, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on the Pentagon Papers, they said, and I quote, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." What is your response to that?
Well, I can talk.
Sure.
I would argue that this issue with the Pentagon Papers is a much different situation. I do not believe that keeping our diplomatic cables secret is a type of deception in government. I think our communications between diplomats should be allowed to be kept private in order to protect the integrity of how we interact with other nations, in order to protect how our relations with other nations can be improved and worked on. And I don't think how we interact with other nations is a form of deception that we're keeping from the American people.
Anything to add?
Yeah, one more quick thing about the Pentagon Papers. The papers themselves were not. What the Cablegate has done is they actually release information on personnel and people's lives. Like they release people like secrecy or people who are spies. And these are actually endangered plans. And they also have, whereas Pentagon Papers did not actually release information about CIA spies or who's working with the CIA. And I think it's a different sphere. Like their sphere is mostly like public issues, and this is more personnel issues, as in vital plans, as in more personal, more strategic issues. Whereas the Pentagon Papers are not focusing on that.
So, what are some of the specific cables that are released that actually harm the U.S. national security?
Why you bring it home together?
Well, first, just a preliminary note, these cables leaked, over the past few days. So you're asking us to predict what the results of these are going to be over the course of possibly several years. And that, we know a lot, but we don't know that much. So we don't know what the negative implications are going to be until there are negative consequences. Do you have anything pulled up?
I'm trying to find it.
Yes. However, have been released cables that do specify by name people working undercover in the Middle East, and earlier in this year that a diplomat had to be was declared persona non grata by Costa Rica. She was a diplomat to Costa Rica, and by cables that she was criticizing the government for valid reasons, she ended up her life was potentially put in danger, and she had to leave immediately. So, and
I have another example, yeah.
Last question. Thank you so much.
I have the example. I guess I was asking.
Next, we will have WikiLeaks.
Okay.
I'll just ask that question.
Oh, yeah, I think someone on the chair.
Hi everyone, my name is Bela White, and this is Anne Rothen. Today we are representatives for WikiLeaks as Julian Assange, the creator, is not with us. Today we're going to be addressing the issue of Cablegate, and it began in 2010 when we started leaking things, and culminated yesterday in September, where we released all 260,000 cables in our database. So the problem we are facing is that the United States think that its population is too informed, and then our leaders do not like answering questions about the decisions that they have made. They prefer that their citizens remain ignorant and trusting with no opinions or minds of their own, who has time to answer tricky questions regarding validity or morality. And those brave enough to answer these questions are vilified and ostracized, deemed whistleblowers or even traitors. Yet their heroic acts are done out of love for their country and for the ideals for which she stands. Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers." Our recent publication of over 260,000 diplomatic cables was done out of respect for our fellow Americans who deserve to know the truth about the time they live in and the government they trust. We intended to release these cables gradually so that each could be appreciated and leave its rightful impact. But in doing so, we realized that we were only depriving the rightful owners, the people, of this information while helping the government to maintain its facade. These cables were released in their unedited form, giving the readers a completely unbiased account on which to base their opinions. To say that we have threatened national security or put lives in danger by releasing these cables is simply unjustified and an incorrect aspersion. These documents received sloppy and weak protection and were obtained less through technical skill than through a lack of proper security. The classified documents were located in one easily accessed location with negligent security. This would be the Secret Internet Protocol Router Network, or SIRPnet. While the clearance necessary to access these files is secret, over 3 million people working in the government have the clearance to access these files. So in the case of these diplomatic cables, an Army analyst was able to access 2 separate networks, write a split file, and upload it to a blank CD, masked as a Lady Gaga album. No one suspected anything when the analyst walked off base with 250,000 files in hand.
Now when we received these files, we used them with the good intention of spreading awareness. They could have just as easily been obtained by ill-wishing terrorist organizations. Many brave people give us information for which we do not ask, but have an obligation to share when received. Since our beginning, none of our sources has been compromised to our knowledge. To maintain anonymity, we use many servers through multiple countries, and we do not keep logs, therefore our logs can never be stolen. Files are anonymous long before they reach our servers, allowing sources to use our electronic Dropbox without the fear of discovery. We know that many of our sources make great sacrifices and take large risks in exposing important stories, so we respect their actions and believe the means by which they obtained their information irrelevant. The Supreme Court's landmark Pentagon Papers ruling established that a media outlet may legally publish information that was obtained illegally, as long as the outlet did not play a role in obtaining this information in the first place. This ruling is supported by the unanimous decision in Landmark Communications versus Virginia and in Barnicky versus Boffer. In addition, the First Amendment protects speech as long as it does not pose a clear and present danger, which the court has determined to be an extremely high standard. After weighing the danger posed by the release of these largely unclassified documents against the value in allowing the free press to hold the government accountable for illegal and unconscionable acts, it's easy to see why no criminal charges have ever been brought against WikiLeaks. We have been the target of moderately sized DDoS attacks since the initial release of these files in November 2010. The most prominent of these was a botnet attack by a hacker named Jester. We will not let these attacks stop our pursuit of justice and truth. We are prepared to move our files to cloud servers and take the necessary actions in providing constant access to them. We gather this information for the sole purpose of sharing it. The present media has lost sight of the true goal of broadcasting. As they compete with each other for better ratings, they inadvertently take part in the censorship that they claim to reject while hoarding information. We share all of our stories to the greater public and with other news organizations. The citizens of this country are responsible for holding the government accountable for unlawful actions, and the press is responsible for informing these citizens.
1 minute warning.
As the United States Supreme Court ruled, only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. These cables mark a turning point.
And it is not just for the citizens' benefit that WikiLeaks is essential. Scrutiny will strengthen the country and the government. As a formal government official said, "The world is moving irreversibly in the direction of openness, and those who learn to operate with fewer secrets will ultimately have the advantage over those who futilely cling to a past in which millions of secrets can be protected. Secrecy can be best preserved only when credibility is truly maintained." Thank you.
We're now open for questions.
spoke a lot about the country informing the citizenry, the American people have a right to know what the government's doing in their name, and that was the purpose of your act. My question is, your founder, your beloved founder, is he an American citizen?
No. No, he's not.
So, in regards to the names of whistleblowers and victims of government persecution named in the files, and there have been whistleblowers and these victims named in the files, does your organization view them as collateral damage to a greater good you're doing?
So actually, WikiLeaks has an extensive review process whereby we assess people whose lives may be put in danger by the release of information, and typically we would work with our knowledge of those situations to limit the release of that information. Actually, before we started releasing these cables, we asked the State Department to cooperate with us in identifying which details might be particularly sensitive, and they outright refused. So that one's on you.
But even beyond the source that you talked about, are you aware that there's actually been some Taliban retaliation on Afghan elders in Afghanistan as a result of the information that was released by your organization?
So it's not in retaliation to the release of the information, it's in retaliation to the actions committed by the government, including the illegal detainment of people without charge at secret prisons and brutal torture and murders.
Yeah, but it's based on the reason why they have the information is because of your guys' organization releasing it.
Right, but the world in which this information comes out and those secret prisons don't exist anymore is a better world than the world where people are being held and tortured and murdered in secret prisons, and it just continues.
Yeah. So how can you justify releasing this information when many of the cables included are critical to U.S. interests? For example, the Critical Foreign Dependencies Initiative, which was referenced in a number of cables, which specifically requests American diplomats identify installations overseas whose loss could critically impact the public health, economic security, and or national and homeland security of the United States.
So I want to talk about a little bit about this secret classification. I think it's over 4.5 million government employees have the ability to classify something as secret. And I'm just from my own personal opinion, I think when that many people have the ability to classify something as secret, no, not even just secret, top secret, they have the ability to do that. It really diminishes the potency of that classification.
That actually includes foreign citizens as well. So when the information is being stored in a database where 4.5 million people have basically unrestricted access, that's where the problem is. That's where the leaks come from. If Chelsea Manning, who by the way is a woman, was able to access that information and give it to us, then you have no guarantee of that information being secret. Like people, foreign governments, enemies of the United States, most likely already have that information because 2 million other people also have that same clearance.
But that doesn't answer my question of what justifies you to release that information that the U.S. government has deemed critical to our interests.
Well, this goes back to our firm belief that the only way to counter deception in government and expose the government's bad secrets is to release all information without hindrance.
Yeah, citizens have a right to know what goes on behind the scenes. Without that information, they can't guarantee that their government is upholding their wishes and acting on their behalf.
We're not encouraging negative actions, we're just putting the information out there for people to use in a positive or negative manner. We're leaving that up to them.
All right, thank you guys. Great job. We have Edward Stone's legal team and advocates.
Academic caution. Academic language. Oh, sorry. I don't. Because I swear like the guide, so we just know where we're going.
All right. All right. So we're with the ACLU representing the Team Edward division. So we'd like to give a little bit of background as to whom Edward Snowden is, and then talk a little bit about what he released before suggesting a few policy changes we think would help a lot with allowing
us to fix what we think is wrong with a lot of these laws. So Snowden was an NSA contractor from my home state of Maryland, and he was able to get into a lot of information that the U.S. had about two particular data collection techniques, PRISM and Upstream. And he was able to get all of that information out and give them to a few reporters in Hong Kong and Moscow. Now, we, first of all, do not believe him to have broken the law, because he signed a contract when he became a contractor in which he both swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, which he did because these data collection techniques are both unconstitutional and unconscionable. And within the contract, it also specifies that whistleblowing is a non-criminal charge, but rather a civil charge. So before we move on to policy changes, we'd like to give a little bit of background on what the programs are. So we have PRISM, which is the one everyone's heard of, and basically it allows the government to go into different databases owned by tech companies and ask for any piece of information they want, basically, and get it with pretty much no oversight or questions asked. There's also Upstream, which is honestly a little bit even worse, where they actually take in thousands of gigabytes of information from huge cables going under the internet that enter and exit the U.S. and store it to the point that there's a huge data farm in Utah that is able to store more data than exists, which is pretty impressive. So we'd like to talk to Michael, who's going to talk a little bit more about policy changes.
All right, so the first statistic that I would like to present is simply that the NSA requires that any searches of the database, they need to get reasonable articulatable suspicion, which essentially is legal jargon for saying they have to put into a sentence the reason why they're spying on U.S. citizens. And so of the 17,000 items on an alert list, only 1,800 of them actually met the reasonable articulatable suspicion standards. So even the very limited set of protections that we've established to prevent the NSA from doing blanket surveillance aren't actually being enforced. And so until you have real oversight and real transparency of the NSA, which we're beginning to get thanks to courageous individuals such as Snowden, any reforms made to the NSA simply will not have any meaningful effect. So there's a long list of systemic changes that can be made to the oversight and accountability of the NSA. To begin with, the FISA Court of Appeals is currently a non-adversarial process, which means that the only people that the government hears, or that the court hears any argument from, is the government, which allows them to significantly twist and create biases that favor their own argument. And in addition, to prevent judges from making poorly guided decisions in the realm of technology, we should provide technological experts to judges at all levels of government to stop them from falsely conflating real world and cyber examples. The discussion we had earlier about SOPA and PIPA and brick and mortar shops, I think, is a good example where government officials falsely conflate the two examples. Also, the FISA court opinions are currently classified, which means that even if the court were to rule the programs unconstitutional, the American people would never find out about it. So we should issue redacted versions of the FISA court. And in addition, the idea that NSA officials are allowed to perjure themselves before Congress and not receive any form of retribution is a serious problem. The congressional oversight does not function if the people they're in charge of watching are allowed to openly lie to them in a public testimony. In addition to this, separating the or having the head of NSA and the head of Cyber Command be two different people as opposed to both be Keith Alexander. That creates a huge conflict of interest and has led to the purposeful undermining of our cryptographic standards. NIST was recently embarrassed due to NSA activities. So that is the list of policy recommendations for oversight. In addition to having Congress and the courts actually watch the executive branch, we need to allow the public some, at least a small window into the inner workings of government, which requires an increase in declassification. We should coordinate the declassification agencies among the varying government organizations and increase funding instead of decrease funding, which is what we're currently doing. This has two benefits. One allows the public to actually understand what their government is doing, and okay, sorry.
Any questions?
Yeah, basically. FOIA is important, and we need to stop data laundering, and that's, yeah, open myself up to questions.
Hi, Peggy Noonan from the Wall Street Journal. As part of Mr. Snowden's onboarding, did he sign the required document stating he would not disseminate classified information to the public?
Yes. But we believe that it was a state contract he signed, and fair enough. Continue.
Would you agree that the role of national intelligence agencies is to safeguard national security?
Oh, that's funny. The numbers on this are actually pretty dismal.
Beyond the scope of the NSA, please.
We don't have to be on the scope of the NSA.
The issue. So the NSA, when pressed for what actually this prevented, government spokesman cited 54 concrete examples of things that were actually thwarted by the NSA.
First, the declassified cases, but there are a number of cases pending which we cannot declassify due to their importance to national security.
Those cases are not declassified.
Well, hold on. And then for a second metric, NSA Chief Alexander admitted that of these 54, only 13 concerned the U.S. So
There's several thousand kilobytes or gigabytes of data that were used to make 13 things noticed. That's not very helpful.
I would also like to point out that the relevance of the NSA data in these 54 cases has actually been contested in many of them, and that the suspects could have been caught using more traditional means.
Peggy? CNN. Yeah, right? All right. Could you elaborate on the difference between a whistleblower and a traitor?
well,
it's an interesting
excuse
one.
me. Yeah. Snowden could have profited off this. He could have sold.
In general, I don't care about Snowden. In general, what is the difference between a whistleblower and a traitor?
A traitor sells out his country for his own profit.
A traitor has malicious intent.
Snowden does not.
So. You seem really happy about this. We would not ever consider Snowden to be like a media cow or like something like that. He's made almost no money on this. He's currently trapped in Moscow to no personal gain, and he clearly did this.
What's your name?
Jones.
Mr. Jones over here just said that a traitor is someone who betrays their country with malicious intent. Yes?
Yes, I did say that.
So are you two not in agreement? Perhaps you should take a minute and agree on what your stance is. And I'll wait.
I'm sure. I'm pretty certain we're in agreement on this.
Quite an agreement. We never neither of us said that Edward Snowden did this with malicious intent, and I don't believe he would argue this at all.
But you're using a different definition of traitor.
And I never said he was a traitor. You did.
No, I'm not saying anybody's a traitor. I'm just asking for you.
Is word games your best argument, or is?
I'm not having. I am reporting unbiased media for CNN.
Thank you. Unbiased for CNN.
All right, guys.
Sorry.
You want my computer? Yeah, just figure out how this up. Can I slide my backpack underneath you? I'm Oh, ours is a little bit short, so we have 10 minutes. Dude, hang that necessary? No, put that up on the What? Alright. No! Dude, just relax. Alright. Oh, here we go. Yes! We got this. Come on. I have faith in you.
Are you having trouble getting it to come up?
Just start talking.
Let me help you.
Alright, just change it to ads on BGA. Oh, thank God I'm not NSA, right?
You need a systems administrator.
Alright. Take Coral, Alright, whatever. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Unfortunately, President Obama was unable to join us. He had some important matters to attend to regarding Syria. As many of you know, I am Michael Daniel, the Special Assistant to the President and Cybersecurity Coordinator. Today, I'm joined by CIA Director of Public Relations, Dean Boyd, NSA Manager in charge of coordinating the internal response to these data breaches, Richard Leggett, and the Senior Senator from California and Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Ms. Dianne Feinstein, in announcing the latest steps forward in the federal government's ongoing efforts to combat unauthorized access to classified documents within the intelligence community's computer systems. Now, as part of a coordinated multi-agency review of the events and policies that allowed an American citizen to exfiltrate large quantities of classified data, we have developed a series of technical and policy solutions to restore the public's trust. First, I'd like to hand the podium over to Dean Boyd to talk about the future strategies within the intelligence community as a whole.
Thank you, Michael. It was reported by several media sources that the individual allegedly responsible for the breach was an employee of the CIA prior to being an employee of the NSA. While I cannot comment on the veracity of these reports, the intelligence community is comprehensively reviewing internal security mechanisms and is adopting a broad range of new measures designed to mitigate the exploited vulnerabilities. Entities in the intelligence community are now proactive in sharing information on personnel who may harbor intent to compromise data security, and a blacklist of personnel who lost security clearances is to be shared between agencies. These measures to vet personnel are especially critical, not only to prevent the possibility of internal attacks, but to foster a sense of trust amongst employees in the intelligence community, to whom trust is a critical resource due to the highly sensitive nature of their work. Beyond these measures to prevent infiltration by individuals who harbor intent to illicitly disseminate information, the intelligence community is also reviewing the rights of system administrators and other technical personnel. File access privileges, particularly with respect to quantity, are under discussion regarding potential limitations. Furthermore, methodologies that allow sysadmin to perform their functions while limiting their access to data are being analyzed for their feasibility. Moreover, additional levels of security clearances are being considered in such a manner that there will be horizontal partitioning in addition to classic vertical partitioning to prevent wide-scale access of data that would be irrelevant to the employee's work. This measure would limit the scope of data leaked in the event of a breach. I would now like to pass the podium to Deputy Director of the NSA, Richard Leggett.
Thank you. The situation within the NSA that allowed this data breach to happen is very common among other industries as well. There were two conditions which allowed this data breach to occur. First, there was a catastrophic failure by the NSA to properly defend its internal networks against malicious insider. Although we had very strict need-to-know protocols on documents for all users, we were not monitoring administrators' actions, particularly with regard to movement of files. Now we have cracked down on unsupervised access by contractors. Contractors will no longer be able to perform administrative actions without the presence of a federal employee. Second, a common occurrence among administrators was exploited. The basic problem of a strict role-based system is that sometimes you will need to perform tasks that are outside your role. By abusing the trust of another employee, someone could borrow the credentials of another user to perform reconnaissance on the security features and requirements necessary to access particular files. Although this was and still is strictly against NSA and DoD policy, we have implemented new technological features to make this more difficult. This is a particularly shameful event in NSA history, and you deserve better. But rest assured, we have done everything in our power to correct the situations which resulted in this incident. Thank you.
Good afternoon. On the subject of current events, in response to the events over this past summer, the contract with U.S. Investigation Services Incorporated is on hold, and we are investigating the actions of USIS and all current background check contractors. As for changes to the current surveillance operations, we continue to gain a wide range of views, we will continue to gain a wide range of views before any steps are taken. After many weeks of consultation with Mr. Daniel and General Alexander, I am pleased to announce that in the coming days, I will be introducing new legislation to the Senate that will greatly improve the nation's ability to resist sophisticated cyber attacks. This legislation will allow companies to share data with the federal government when they believe they are under attack. Currently, the weakest part of our national cyber defense is operated by the private industry, and our adversaries actively look for ways to exploit this weakness. Large American corporations can be taken down during a cyber attack, and there is no government structure in place to analyze the detailed records of the attack. The government has access to a huge array of data about incursions in government systems, in addition to some of the best subject matter experts in the world. The goal of this bill is to allow, but not require, companies to share their data on potential attacks with the government so they can get feedback and insights, while also we're also allowing the government to gain a better understanding of cyber attacks happening on private industry. We now open the floor to questions.
Now, this is so we're really glad to hear that you guys have patched up some of the holes you had in regards to security. So how can we as Americans keep our security from you, like in general?
You don't have a shot.
Sorry?
Well, it is true that there are the Americans need to be protected not only from foreign powers, but also from other Americans. And the part of the goal of the NSA is to protect the collective, all Americans, instead of making sure that every single individual American's privacy is kept in place, especially if that privacy would be detrimental to other Americans.
Michael? You say that we need to be protected from other Americans, but I like to remind our esteemed friends of the NSA that they too are Americans. And how can the people feel secure from those who are theoretically protecting them when Obama has created an executive order allowing him to reclassify previously declassified information based on the fact that a U.S. citizen submitted a FOIA request? How is that system of transparency at all allow for government accountability?
Well, all activities in the intelligence apparatus are subject to externally developed constraints. While some matters may have to be reclassified in the wake of these constraints, we assure you that we strive to balance both individual liberty with necessary precautions regarding the sensitivity of our material.
You stated that the goal of the NSA is to protect Americans collectively, is that correct?
Yes.
How do you justify wholesale sabotage of security research?
We believe that in the face of national security threats of greater measure, some systems may have to be selectively compromised for potential use in subverting these greater attacks.
Isn't this program a violation of the Constitution, which says that you have to have a warrant if you're going to search or receive close communications? How do you justify this as being consistent with the Fourth Amendment?
Well, that's still under investigation currently, and we can't comment on that. But if people really want to shove aside a potential method of protection, and the court says that it's not constitutional, then that will be the end of it. But this is something that's currently under discussion, and there haven't been any solutions reached at the moment.
So do you think that the founding fathers would have been okay with, say, George III looking at communications of Americans, and so they would have, when they wrote the Fourth Amendment, they would have assumed that the parallel would be okay today?
I think that we live in a very different time where terrorism is a threat, and that's something that really keeps me up at night. And I just want to protect Americans.
These are all real quick.
One more question.
Yeah.
You guys pick.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go back to you guys.
You say that this is something that's to be resolved by the courts, but one of the reasons why the FISA Court of Appeals allowed for the bulk collection of records to be conducted was on the assumption that should this data be used to incriminate an American citizen, that would be revealed during the discovery process. And as some of the leaks have shown, both the FBI and the IRS have been conducting massive data laundering in order to conceal the fact that the NSA is using this information.
Can you cite a specific instance, like a person, when this was used against them?
That's the joy of it, because you guys keep it classified.
So what you're saying is you cannot.
I could. Yeah, I mean, if we had a functioning Freedom of Information Act, then I might be able to get the document.
It sounds like you just want to blame the guy behind the curtain. If you had actual evidence, you would gladly address the question. Thank you. No more questions.
Let's just all swap. You guys are first. Alright. Ready? Okay, yeah. Hello, my name is Robert Morris, and I am a graduate student at Cornell University in the Computer Science Department. In the fall of 1988, I released a computer worm the purpose was to gauge the size of the internet. The way that the worm worked was it would download itself onto a computer, and then using the internet find other computers that it would then download itself onto. While it was on the computer, while it could have easily stolen information or deleted everything on the computer, I had no intent of harming the user or causing any malicious actions, so literally all it did was download it itself and found somewhere else to go. In addition to not causing any harm, the worm, I wanted it to use the minimum amount of computing and memory resources, so it wouldn't disrupt the user's day-to-day activities and they wouldn't even know it was there. And lastly, when the computer is shut down, the worm is also shut down. The average computer user shuts it down like every 1 to 2 weeks, so in theory the worm should have just been on there, you wouldn't even know for a week or two, and then it'd be gone. Had everything gone according to plan, none of you would even know that this worm existed. Unfortunately, there's a bug in the worm. So before downloading itself onto a computer, the worm asks, is this already running? But it would be really easy to write something that just always says yes to that. So to account for that, and then if it always says yes, it would never actually get onto the computer. So to account for that, I had it download itself onto a computer once in every 7 times that it responds yes to account for this error. Unfortunately, 7 was too small of a number, and the Morris worm, or my worm, ended up basically taking over some computers. As soon as I found out that happened, I reached out to as many people as I could to warn them and worked with a colleague to come up with a solution to remove the worm from infected computers and to prevent it from getting onto other machines. Once we came up with that solution, we broadcast it to as many people as we could, because again, I really didn't mean for this to happen. Honestly, I don't understand why I'm on trial for this. I had no intent of breaching federal computers, which is what I've been charged with. I assumed that the federal government would have very basic, security defenses in place preventing something as benign as my worm from actually accessing them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Graham, and I'll be representing Mr. Morris' worm in the trial later this month. So, according to Section 1030A 5A of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, only a clear intent to gain unauthorized access to the federal computer system or a clear intent to damage such a system is punishable by law. Mr. Robert Morris did not have either of these intentions, but unfortunately his worm did end up accessing federal computer systems. But at this point, Mr. Robert Morris could have, stolen highly sensitive information from these systems, but instead, Mr. Morris decided to send out a solution to the problem through his friend from Harvard. So I think this speaks volumes about Mr. Morris's benevolent intentions. Over the past 2 years, it has become clear that before Mr. Morris released his worm, the internet was like a small town where people thought little of leaving their doors unlocked. Internet security was only discussed in theory, and no institution, private or public, gave it the importance that it clearly deserved. By revealing a considerable number of security vulnerabilities that are present on the internet today, Morris's worm has been able to force people to evaluate the security flaws within their own products before releasing their products to the world. And this has also ensured an increased demand for security experts in all the industries. Furthermore, more importantly, now the possibility of a new industry that deals exclusively with internet security and safeguards the internet is now within sight. So my personal opinion is that instead of prosecuting Mr. Morris for unintentionally gaining access to federal computer systems, Mr. Morris should be consulted to fix some of the vulnerabilities that are present on the internet today. Thank you.
Now, open up the question.
Yeah, someone.
Why did Mr. Morris disguise and delete the worm from an MIT computer?
Well, Mr. Morris did his undergrad at Harvard, and at Harvard he spent a lot of time using MIT software. So he just thought to get his goal of measuring how large the internet was, just based on personal experience, he thought that MIT would be a better platform to release it.
Yes.
With the lack of intent that Morris claims, why is it that the implementation of the worm contains in the dictionary?
Can you repeat
Can you
that a little
repeat
louder?
So you claim a lack of intent to compromise the infected system, but if that's so, why did your implementation of the worm contain a dictionary password?
Could you repeat the question?
Basically, why did the implementation of the worm contain a dictionary of passwords? So there were several security vulnerabilities that I used to have the worm download itself onto computers, and one of those was weak passwords that would be stored in this kind of dictionary. So while the password was the worm used the password to get onto the computer, the worm never sent that information back to me personally. Like, I don't know anyone's passwords. The worm just used it so it could download itself. But I didn't take that information at all.
Mr. Morris, when you were a graduate student at Cornell, were you aware that the federal government maintained computer networks?
I cannot.
Did you know that the federal government had computer networks when you were a student at Cornell? Did you know that they existed, that the federal government maintained computer networks?
I believe Mr. Morris was aware of this fact, except Mr. Morris also assumed that the federal government's networks would be secure enough such that his worm could not infect such a network.
So your intended purpose was to gauge the size of the public internet, that's
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And knowing that federal networks might well be part of that network, knowing that they existed, would you then not have intended to gain unauthorized access to a federal network?
It was the personal computers that we were trying to gain access to. It wasn't the federal government. It was more so the private computers.
If I had intentionally tried to get the worm to go onto federal computers, then I would have sought those out. I personally have no idea where, if the worm is on a federal computer or at a school or at a personal computer or whatever. If I intended to breach federal computers, then the worm would have some functionality to let me know when I had reached a federal computer, but that was not at all in the implementation, and that was not my intention at all.
All right, guys, we should probably switch teams, but thank you. Good job. So it's nearing the end of class, so if you have to go, if you can stay, please stay, but if you have to go, I understand.
It's okay. Let's stop introducing you.
I'm Peter F. Nolan.
Please say your name and
Then let him start. He just keep asking. Yeah. I'm the
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Rosh, Department of Justice, Trial Prosecutor.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter F. Narona, Department of Justice, Attorney.
Frederick J. Scullin Jr., United States Attorney.
Ben Lincoln, U.S. Attorney.
The fall of 1988 saw a curious first-year graduate student under Cornell's Computer Science PhD program uses knowledge, skills, and facilities and access to facilities to launch a malicious computer program on a national group of computer networks, also known as the Internet. Given authorized access to Cornell's Computer Science Division, Robert Morris designed a computer program that was released into the Internet. I know what you're thinking, Cornell. 2 years later, Morris has still not been convicted, and all that has changed is that we have given a name to this malicious computer program, a worm. What were interesting facts was that were the methods of release and the structure of this computer program. Morris released this worm from an MIT computer to disguise it and to prevent it from tracing back to him. The worm was also ingeniously designed to exploit the utility software in computer systems with a little tweak that allowed it to duplicate itself onto one in every 7 computers that already had it.
So a worm is a program that can run by itself and can propagate a fully working version of itself to other machines over the network. Now the Morris worm exploited flaws in utility programs packaged with Unix that allowed the worm to break into host machines and replicate itself, infecting the system. Now the worm then collected host, network, and user information, which was then used to break into other connected systems via more security exploits. Now it would then once again compromise the new system and begin spreading again, thereby eventually infecting some thousands of machines. Now, any worm is detrimental to the target system, and it, at a minimum, causes a loss of bandwidth. Now, its damage depends for a major part on its payload, and Morris worm's payload was high enough to put a lot of strain on the network infrastructure whenever it spawned. Now, given the loss of so much computing time over so many machines, the damage is estimated at least $5,000 per machine. Now, the design of the Morris worm raises many questions about the intent of the accused. To avoid infecting the same machine twice, new instances of the worm are meant to ask their host machine if it already had a copy of the worm and terminate if the answer was yes. However, to prevent usage of a fake worm to counteract the infection mechanism, the worm would proceed with infection regardless of the existence of a prior copy once every 7 times. Additionally, the Morris worm does not execute its termination instruction until substantial headway has been made into the password cracking process, making concurrent copies even more resource intensive on the host machine. Now, being a procedural program, Morris worm ensures maximum execution of itself. This means that even if it gets shut down 6 out of 7 times, it's not before a substantial part of the program is executed and stops only after a lot of resources have been consumed. Another very suspicious aspect of the worm's design is the fact that it ensures that it always sustains its normal priority status. The program is never assigned background priority by the task scheduler, which ensures that it occupies the highest priority at all times during its attempt to infect the system. As if the fact that the worm was disguised to have been born in MIT was not enough, it also tried pinging the Berkeley server. Now, this could have well been an attempt either to falsify the worm's origins or to eventually check into the system, send host data to the server, and make it some sort of a backdoor. Now, this attempt in itself raises serious questions about the intent of the accused.
After causing massive damage in the form of loss of information, restricted access to federal computers for government officials, catatonic systems in medical research facilities, military sites, and university networks, Morris took his casual time and released delayed anonymous instructions on how to remove the worm from the computer. However, by then the damage had already been done, and Morris had violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Title 18. Some of the laws violated are Section 1030A5A, which obviously did not completely state. The law states that any damage over $5,000 is considered a crime. This clause is a tangible clause which measures the crime in terms of a monetary value rather than the intention. This worm is estimated to have caused a damage of over $10 million, along with gaining access to federal computers and showing intent to cause damage. Section 1030A2 Section 1030A2 gave the worm access to several computers that contained financial records of financial institutions. Section 1030A1 allowed Morris to gain access to federal computers that contain information pursuant to an executive order. And under a relevant subsection of 1030C4A1, the accused can be sentenced to imprisonment for over 5 years. The very fact that Morris broke several laws pertaining to this act in terms of loss of information, restricted access, monetary damages, etc. must be noted. Morris must be held accountable for his actions, as he did commit a severe crime, irrespective of how malevolent his intentions were. It is due to his role in the origin of this program that Morris must be severely punished.
We are open for questions.
So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was implemented with the law saying that he had to have intent and then cause damage. I mean, the way that's like written has been subject to speculation, but it has been specified that there must be intent. What proof do you have of intent?
Just to clarify, the act is a bit more complicated than that. There are two different types of intention that we are looking at. Firstly, what is clear is that the intention to access these protected computers unauthorized without authority must be held. But there is no clause in the act that requires the intention, any malicious intent to exist for the act to be applicable. So the court does agree that Mr. Morris, through his looking at the design of Mr. Morris's worm, there's probably no malicious intent there, and that is why he was only charged under subsection C4. In other parts of the act, he could have been charged for up to 20 years in jail, but in this case, you only gave him 3 years probation because he definitely doesn't have a malicious intent. However, looking at the design of Mr. Morris's worm, we have judged that he did intend to access state-protected computers.
Yes, we are not talking about malicious intent. So we're talking about the clause that you are speaking about, which is what he was sentenced for, which determines that he intended to gain unauthorized access.
Yes.
You're also referencing events in the future because this is happening right now before the trial.
Before the trial.
Oh, sorry about that.
But you also what proof do you have that I had intent to access federal computers?
Well, as my fellow prosecutor just mentioned, any worm to any extent in its deployment does cause damage to its host network and host machine. So it's clear in the design of the worm, fundamentally in its classification as a worm, that there was some damage, or collateral or not, that you had accepted as part of the operation of the worm.
Well, what is the intent?
Yeah.
Where is his intent?
Well,
Accessing federal computers because that is what
So in 1986, the law was amended such that if the damage caused was over $5,000, that would override the intention. So although the intent was not malicious, if the damage is over 5,000, which is clearly the case since it's 10 million,
Where did you get 10 million from?
Oh, that's just estimated. That's just an estimate.
Official
Well,
estimate.
the estimate, regardless, if you look at 6,000 machines infected, even at $500 per machine, that's far outstrips the bare minimum.
So if $500 per machine, couldn't the machines be scrapped for other pieces? Was every single part of the machine?
Well, you're asking then to bring down the entire infrastructure for several days while that process occurs. Is that not further damage?
I'm just curious where you came up with your numbers from. And
Damage to the machines? Well, loss of computing time, for one. There's the opportunity cost of, say, business operations that were interrupted, medical research interrupted, federal infrastructure that was damaged, the bandwidth costs across the network.
Military-sized universities, the worm affected computer systems all over the nation.
The
so
sheer
were these
scale.
So are these costs of lost business time or were these costs of destroyed computers?
Infrastructure and business costs. They're both tangible and non-tangible.
Great. Okay. Good job, guys.
we are gonna start. Hello. Okay, do you have any questions before we start? About anything, I guess? No? Okay, I'm DK. I'm a PhD student here. I work with Eugene Charnier on natural language processing stuff. I will show you some examples that I work on, but I'm going to talk about linear classifiers, particularly in high base and logistic regression classifiers. They are really powerful, so if you want to do some sort of machine learning work in the future, then you want to know them well. Okay, here are some examples where they can be useful. So this is called like sentiment analysis. You want to know whether a document or a sentence is positive or negative. So if you're a company like Amazon or Google, you may want to know. You may want to know whether a product is popular or not. Can you tell me whether this reviews are positive or negative? Who think this is positive? Who think this is negative? Yeah, and this is a review on the Haribo gummy bears. They're really good, but if you consume too many, then you may have some problem. And this is the current project I'm working on. This is called RNA detection. I don't know where this can be useful, but actually the Army is funding this project. I don't know why Army is interested in, but okay. Before having any context, who thinks this is ironic? Who thinks this is sincere? I guess there's no Republican here. So this was the post, and this was the actual comment people are making, and who thinks this is ironic for sure? Yeah, thanks. And yeah, we are collecting the data from Reddit, and we are labeling the comment which one is correct, ironic or not, and we want to classify whether a sentence is ironic or not. And you can use a naive-Bayes or logistic regression to start with. So when you are doing linear classification, you'll have some kind of data points in some high-dimensional space. Here, the data points are two-dimensional. So x1, x2, there will be features the features I'm going to use. So given the data points, you want to find the colors. The colors will be class or labels. And once you train your the model on naive-Bayes or logistic regression, you want to know some other unseen data, and you want to classify what that belongs, where that black dot belongs to. Who thinks that's red? Who thinks that's blue? Who doesn't care? We humans are really good at, even though I don't tell you what to do, you just know that's red, because our brains are, I guess, tuned to figure out the patterns. But computers don't know anything about it, so in order to have a system, you need to specifically tell what they need to learn. So we are going to tell them what to learn by telling them to construct a function or model. They are the same thing, so don't get confused. And how we do it, we're going to provide some training data. By supervised learning, the models are going to given the label training data. By labels, given the data point, they will have some class. The class label here, y, can be discrete or continuous, but we are going to focus on the binary random variable, the binary classification here. So it's going to be either 1 or 0, 1 meaning positive example, 0 meaning negative example. The x's are the features. So in the linear classification example here, they were the x and x1 and x2 coordinates. In the spam filtering, there will be words, and you could choose whatever you want, but you want to pick them right so that the model works well. Here, the superscript is the training index. So if this will say that's the first training data and that's the first class, and there will be the nth training data and nth class. And usually the features will be vectors. So vector of, so you will have x, let me show you some example first. Okay, this is a toy example I made for spam filtering. So the three, except the last one, everything will be features. Here are the words, and this will be your feature vector, and this will be a class. And each one of them will be individual feature. So here, the X will be $, and free and money. And that will be spam. Is that clear? And we want to learn a mapping function that maps X to Y. And we want to have a training data. We are going to train it on a training data and test it on some unseen data. You might think that you could train everything on a big data and test it on the same data, but there's a problem if you do so. Does anyone know what could be a potential problem here? Yeah.
You could overfit to your training data.
Okay, that's one problem, but there's a bigger problem. Anyone who knows the big problem when you have only one training and testing data? Yeah?
You could just write a function that just puts out the correct one.
Sure, yes, that's the problem. So in Python code, you could have a map that memorizes everything, the input-output pair. So the key to the map will be the feature, and the output will be the class label. And during the testing time, you could spit out the correct answers, but that's not what you want to do. And that's going to fail when you see the new data. So you want to have a separate training and testing data. You want to make sure that they are disjoint. And sometimes you want to have a validation or held out data. You don't need, sometimes you want to have them, sometimes you don't. That totally up to you. And here are some rules that you could rely on. So you have a model that's defined by some parameters, and you will learn the parameters during the training time on the training data. And there may be some very few parameters that affect the model's performance a lot, and you may want to choose them. You want to pick the best possible one by running them on the validation data with different settings and choose the optimal one. And during the testing time, you will see how well it does. So in my toy example, this is the training data and this is the testing data. I made them in a way that they are really different. So no word in the spam appears in the ham, and no word in ham appears in spam. So given this, it's pretty obvious that if you see some word in spam, then you want to spit out whether that's ham or spam. But usually, in reality, you may have words that are overlapping between two different classes. Okay? Any questions? If you have questions, just interrupt. So we define F to be probability distribution. You could choose whatever function you want, but probability distribution is nice. You know some rules, Bayes rule, chain rule, that makes life easy. So that's one good thing. And another good thing about the probability distribution is that when you have a number of the probability, so probability of spam is 0.2, then you may expect if you have 10 documents, you may see 2 spams. And that's really good to have, because when you're debugging or seeing why it's not working, that tells you why. Tells you some information what it is doing. So given that we are going to use the probability distribution, there are 2 ways to approximate this value. The probability of y given x, so probability of the class label of some unseen data. We could use the Bayes rule to learn the probability of word given class and probability of word. This isn't vector, this is a word. So if it doesn't have a arrow on it, that's a single feature. And using the Bayes rule, we could rewrite it as probability of class times probability of feature given class and divide by, this is normalizing it. And given the,
So yeah, when we're running this on features like on the emails, each gram, whether that's unigram or bigram, is considered like completely separate and unordered.
yes, here we assume that the order doesn't matter. So if this was money free dollar in that order, that's the same as the dollar free money. And given the conditional independence assumption that all the features are independent given the class label, so all the words in your document are independent, we could rewrite it as this. And so once you know these values, you could approximate them, the class given feature really easily. Another way to learn this is just learn it directly. And that's what logistic regression is doing. And we're going to talk about the naive Bayes first. So in graphical model, that's what it looks like. Naive Bayes given y, all the features are independent, and then makes model really makes the math really easy, and it nicely works out at the end. And okay, this is a funky story. How when you apply naive Bayes, this is how you assume the data are generated. So I am a spammer. I throw a coin. If it's head, I'm going to generate spam documents. And I have the true distribution, whatever that means, the probability of word given spam. I have that distribution. I'm going to draw words from that distribution, and that's how I generate my spam documents. And if it was tail, then I'm going to draw words from my spam word distribution, ham word distributions, and that's going to my ham emails. Does the process make sense here, even if that's not how you write your emails? But who thinks this is plausible? Who doesn't think, who thinks it doesn't make sense? Okay. It doesn't really make sense. It makes math easy. But when you think about it, when you have spams and non-spams, and when you look at the words, you can really spot some words appear a lot in your spam email, and some words a lot appear in your ham emails. And what naive is trying to do is capture the two different distributions in spam documents and ham documents. And we are going to assume that that's how the emails are generated when we apply naive Bayes. And given this assumption, we could reverse the process, how the emails are generated, and we could learn the probability of class and the probability of word given class. Questions? Does this make sense, the process, even if you don't really like the story? Okay. Okay. I'm going to code up first and tell you why it works. Who likes to see the math first? Oh, who wants to see the programming first? Okay. More people want to see math first, so I'm going to stick to math first. I expected the other way. Okay, these are the parameters, the probability of class and the probability of some word given class. That defines your model completely. And that's called the likelihood, data likelihood. And we want to approximate that by maximizing the likelihood. And we could simplify that joint distribution using the conditional independence assumption here. What's going to be here? Any guesses? We know that the probability, first we are going to apply chain rule. Yeah, probability y.
and probability of x given y. And we know the features are independent, so we could break them down using the product of all those features. And as you see, the probability y and probability of x given y defines the likelihood, and the else meaning the else training data. And we want to maximize it. Well, I took out all the derivations because that was too long, and you could read them in the book. And eventually what you get is the probability of your class label is the number of times that appeared in your training data divided by the total number of the training data. And the probability of some word in some class will be the number of times that word appeared in that document. So if a word like money appeared in your spam data like 1,000 times, and if your spam documents have like 10,000 total number of words, then that's going to be 0.1 here. Okay? Any questions? And this is gonna tell you why we do this and why that makes sense. You think about a case, I have a bin that contains lots of balls, either red or blue. And I took one ball out and I record what the color was, and I'm going to put it back. And I do it 10 times, and if it was 7 red balls and 3 blue balls, what is going to be the probability of getting another ball that's going to be red if I do it again?
7, 10.
Yeah, 7, 10. You may say I have too few samples. Then I could try it 1,000 times or 10,000. 1,000 times. And if it was 700, and now the 0.7 sounds really good, does it? And that's what the maximum likelihood estimate is pretty much doing. It assumes that you have lots of training data. So when you take the ratio of the features, you are going to have the good approximation of your probability distribution. And this works even if you have like a really small number of data, like 10, and that maximizes your likelihood. So that's principle, then this kind of makes sense, right? If you see 700 balls there, you don't want to say that that's going to be 0.1 probability. So let's go back to the code. Okay. So this is your training data. We are going to train the Naive model on this and apply the trained model to the testing data. So first, see what the data looks like. Sure. No. Okay. No. So the Naive Bayes, you just count and divide by the total number of either the training data or the number of words in a class. That's all you need to do. It's really fast, since you need to go through the training data twice or once, depending on how you code it up. So this is how. So I have a tuple of words and their class. And we want to count up how many words appears in certain class, and how many times a spam document appears, and how many times a hem document appears. And yeah. So we are going over the training data, and the word is the tuple, and label is the label. What do you want to do here first? Any idea? Okay.
Calculate the P of Y.
Okay.
For the word.
How would you calculate the P of Y here?
Divide the word by the total number of words.
Okay. So we want to compute this one first, and let's divide it by the total number at the end. So first, we're going to count the number of times a word appears in certain class, and these are how the parameters are initialized. The pi will count how many times spam appeared and how many times ham appeared.
Sorry, what is pi?
It records like how many record the how many times a ham or spam document appeared in your training data, and the setters are going to record like how many times a word appeared in spam or ham documents. Okay. So we are going to increment. Let's do status first. We want to increment whenever we see a word. We want to increment that number by 1, and in its if we see a word in a spam, we want to increment that number in the theta of spam. Okay. So let's make sure the word is in the thetas. And it's going to be accessed by label. And if it doesn't have it, you're going to initialize it. Okay? And we increment it by 1. And let's print it out what it looks like after. So given that we have, I don't know, money, we have 4 money, we expect the count of the theta of spam money to be 4, right? So let's see whether it is printing that. So money, 4, and pretty much it is recording how many times a word appeared in the training data. And that's the theta of some word given ham, and we need to normalize it. That's where we are dividing by the total number of times a class contains the words. Okay. So here, and I forgot to increment the number of times either spam or ham document appears. So we want to increment. If it was the label is either ham or spam, and we are incrementing that by 1. Here we are going to normalize it. So what should I do here? If I
Divide by the number of training data.
Yeah. So it's going to be spam training ham. Right? And we want to normalize data too. How do we do it? Any suggestion?
By the number of words in documents with class K.
Okay. What's the let's say K equals 1 is spam. And what is the N1 here then? The sharp N1. we can just count it since we have the zetas that contains the counts. We could go over the zetas and just add them up, right? So, 0. Let's go over spam first. Word, in words, I don't know, zeta, spam, and then I need to add the counts of that word. So at the end, that's going to contain the total number of times the spam documents, the number of words in the spam documents. And we go over a word and say that's spam to normalize it. Does it make sense? If it doesn't, please tell me so. And we do the same thing for, ham. So and let's look at the values at the end. Do they look okay? Like they look like they sum to 1, and they look like they are divided by the total number of times, and right? And you can, once you have the parameters learned, you go over the testing data. The x will be the words in your testing data for each incidence, and you just multiply it. And you take the one with the bigger probability at the end. So you go over 1 or 0, and you choose the one with the higher probability. So if we do the evaluation, it's accuracy is good. I mean, the class label here is the one that is predicted by the naive base, not from the test in the test data. So it looks like it's doing what it's doing. You're going to eventually implement this classifier for your next project, and pretty much you are doing the same thing. You may do some more tricks like smoothing, because if you see, I mean, as you see here, like computer doesn't appear in spam ever in this particular training data. So that's going to be 0 probability. But you don't want to have a 0 probability. Sometimes you expect your training data not to contain all the possible words in English, right? So you may want to do some smoothing for your project, but that's not a big problem. So let's move on to, does this make sense? Or if it doesn't? Okay. And we are going to do logistic regression. It's about the same thing, but it learns every parameter in totally opposite way. As you see, the graph, everything's dependent of each other. There's no conditional independence like in naive Bayes. And you may say there are 2 to the n parameters that you need to learn, but the logistic function and the linear combination of weights and features allow you to bypass learning all possible 2 to the n parameters. So that's good. This is what logistic function look like. Those are Gaussian. So the big function here is the logistic function. This function is really nice because it's really smooth. You could take a derivative anywhere between 0 and 1. I mean, between these values. I guess they go all the way up to infinity and negative infinity. So you could take a derivative anywhere. And the function is non-linear, which is also nice because this non-linear function can learn what linear functions cannot learn, whatever that means. But those are good 2 features. And I guess you want to see the math first, then okay. There's a set of parameters that's called weights in logistic regression. There are m plus 1 of them. X is the word. The X here is going to be binary features. So if a word appears in a training data, that's going to be either 1 or 0. We are not counting how many times it actually appeared. So if you have a training data, money, 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 and spam, that's going to be money 1. So X, if let's say we index it by the word X money will be 1 for that training instance. Okay?
Sorry, which variable takes on a 0 or 1?
The X here. So in Naive it was either 0 to some positive number that the number of times appeared in training instance. But here we treat it as 0, 1. So if it appears, it's 1. If it doesn't appear, that's going to be 0. Okay? And we have dummy weight. So we are assuming that there is some x0 that's 1 always. And that is called bias term, and that sometimes tells is it pretty much doing that how many times the proportion of your spam documents in your training data. That's what that's going to learn. And unlike in Naive, we are going to directly maximize the probability of y given features. So we are maximizing this. We are not maximizing the likelihood. Yeah.
Why do we only do a binary feature vector rather than still just doing counts of every word?
You could do that too, but I want to try some other feature here. Okay. So yeah, when you are doing like classification, the feature, you can choose whatever feature you want, and you want to choose the good feature. And I want to show that you could choose some other feature here. And there's no closed form like in Naive. So like in Naive, you could just count up and divide by the number of total times. But this function is convex, meaning looks like it's concave though. It should be concave, yeah, but it looks like a nice bell. And you can solve it easily. Any suggestion on what to do with convex problem? We covered a solution in local search.
Hill climbing?
Yeah. So one way of hill climbing is gradient ascent. We covered stochastic gradient ascent. We didn't go in depth. If we do stochastic, we will take out the sum, and after we go over, the stochastic gradient ascent, you go over a training set, one training incidence, and you count some number and update the weight right after you go over the training instance. But in batch gradient ascent, you go over all the training data, you count up, so you sum up all of these numbers, and you made the update right after you went over all the training data. Okay? So let's think about what weights are doing. So here are a really simple case. You have one feature, one weight. They are not vectors, they are scalars. And you have really good alien detector that tells you whether an alien is detected or not. And that's going to be signified by 1, if the alien is more than 10 feet tall. Yeah, no? No humans. Do you know any human who's taller than 10 feet? No? So not. And there are 2 objects, aliens or humans. And eventually you want to return this value, signifying if the x was 1, we want to have this number to be big. And if the x was, that should be negative, sorry, -1. I want to have x to be 1 or -1. And I want to return some small number here. What do you think a good value for w here? If you want this number to be close to 1 when x is positive, and x is positive 1, and this number to be close to 0 when x is -1. Let's say x is 0. I mean, the w is 0. What's this number going to be? Half, right? Half. That's going to be saying, I don't really care what the features are. I'm going to print out that there's half chance you're going to see alien or human. But let's say you increase some w to 1 or more than that. Is this value going to be bigger than half? Who thinks this is going to be bigger than half when w is bigger than 0? Smaller than half. This value is going to be bigger than half. I plugged in some numbers in MATLAB. This isn't actually zeros, but they're really small. When I want them to fit in all of it here, so I just set them to 0 and 0.3. So as you see, if you increase and these are not 1s either. They're close to 1, but they're not 1, so like 0.99 something. So as you increase the w, it is pretty much saying you are really confident about that feature. Since this x is like deciding factor here, if you see an object that's taller than 10 feet, you are pretty much like 100% sure that that's an alien. And this is what it is saying. So if w is positive, that is saying that that feature is a positive example, the positive feature. And the magnitude is telling how confident that feature is. Likewise, if the x was negative, you want to have the feature to be negative, the feature to be positive to print out zeros, because you are sure that when you see some object that's less than 10 feet, then you want to print out 0, that meaning that's a human. Does this make sense? And this is what logistic regression is doing. So if we go into the spam setting, we are going to sum up the feature times the word binary, feature times the weight. And let's say you see some really spammy word like Viagra. What do you think W should be? Like, should it be positive or negative? Yeah. And if it's really spammy, we want it to be like bigger than some other less spammy word. And if it's really hammy, then we want it to be negative. And if it's really hammy, like it happens, it only appears in like ham emails, then we want that number to be like close to negative infinite. But sometimes you want to make sure that they are not, they don't spread out too much. So you may do some regulation tricks, but we are not going to cover this here. And the logistic regression is pretty much trying to find the weight that tells you whether the feature is positive or negative. And the magnitude is telling you how confident the feature is. And let's code that first. Okay. So this is how we update this is the update for the gradient ascent. This is the error, the loss function that we're making. So if this was 1 and the predicting 1 is not 1, then we are making some error here. Does this make sense? If the true label was 1 and your predictor is saying that the probability of predicting the label to be 1 is smaller than 1, then you are making some error here, right? And you want to add the numbers to the weight so that the weights go to the right direction at the end. And this is how we predict after we learn the parameters. When you go to the testing data, this is, if the value is bigger than half, that's going to be 1. And if this is less than half, then the class will be 0. And the f is the logistic function. Okay. Okay, let's see what the data looks like first. Okay, here, this was the data that I used for Naive, but I to count up like how many times a word appears. I'm not going to use like how many times they actually appeared. I'm just going to use it. If it appeared, then that's going to be 1. If it didn't appear, then that's going to be 0. I'm doing that because if a feature doesn't appear, that's going to be 0. And since it's multiplied by 0, we don't need to care about the features that don't appear in one of your training instance. So that's why I have a map that tells you whether a word appeared or not. Okay? So here we initialize the gradient. So we go over all the word in the weights. Where are the weights? So these are weight dictionary that mapped using the key, the word, and it contains the value, the weight. And we also include the 0, that's a dummy weight, the W0 in the equation here, that one. And so we initialize the weights, and you just have word to 0 at the beginning. Okay? And we initialize a gradient. We need to initialize a gradient every time we go through the training data. And we need to compute this value, the x times x, the w times x here. And what do you think I should do here? I just need to compute this value in terms of code. Or if it doesn't make sense, tell me what that doesn't make sense. So I want to compute the exponent of the e function here. And I have the w's using the weights, and x's are the words saying that if it appeared, that's going to be 1. And if it doesn't appear, the word will not be here, so we'll just ignore those. So in order to compute this value, what should I do? The words are tuple of, when it's a dictionary, the keys are word, and the output is the value. Something doesn't make sense, or is it too easy? And if it's not clear, tell me what's not clear.
What exactly is the vector w times vector x?
That's the inner product of two vectors.
It's the what?
Inner product of two vectors. So if you have two vectors and you do dot product, then you're going to do right? And that is what it's saying. And when you expand it, that is multiplying the ones at the same index and just add them up. So we are just adding them up here. Okay. I need to have a variable that's going to count up the w times x. And I'm going to go over word in words. And I'm going to add them up to the total. Are you following me or not?
Yes.
So far, yeah.
Okay. Here, people in this group. Okay, Mr. Odd. Okay, so we are assuming that if word appeared in the tuple, that's corresponding to the xi to be 1, so we don't need to multiply the number. We just have to find the weights. The weight of word, you could have like 1, but if you want. So that's the exponents. And in order to update the gradients, we need to compute this value, and we compute that using this formula here. E to the here the total divided by 1 plus e to the total. Let's say that's 10, like y1. Do I need math here? And we need to add them to the gradients. Before updating them, we are going to add all the instance as we go through the training data, and we are making the update after we went over all the training data. And here we are processing a training data here. Okay? A training instance. For word in words, we need to update the gradient. This is doing here the summing over all the training incidents. So now I need to have a variable that tells me whether this y is 1 or 0. So let's say that's 1 if label equals spam else. Okay. And we subtract our prediction from the y. And we are assuming the x is 1, so that's all we need to do. And at the end, we need to, once we get out of the for loop that's going through all the training data, then we need to update the weights. Here we update the weights. So let's go over all the words in weights and the weights. Word increment the gradient times so eta is some parameter that you need to choose. You want eta to the eta is the step size in the gradient ascent. So like how far would you go when you're hill climbing. You want that number to be some big number, like when you start the gradient ascent, because you are far away from the global maximum. But as you go up, you may want to decrease the gradient step size. There are all kinds of tricks you could do, but here I fix it because that's easy to implement, and here it works on the small training and testing data. And let's see what the weights are like. I hope this is correct. So, oh. Oh, thanks. Okay, this is the first iteration. What is 0, 0? Yeah. Oh, that's the dummy weight, and this is the weight. Do they look plausible? Like, if it's positive, that should indicate that that word is spammy, and if it's negative, that word is meaning that that feature is hammy. So it looks like they're in the right direction, and as we go, they either make it bigger, meaning that word is more spammy than other words. So the money became 0.02. As you see in the training data, money appears a lot in your spam, so you may expect the money to be more spammy than, say, win here. Okay? And as you keep continuing, you see that the words that are more spammy gets bigger and bigger. And the words that are super normal gets big, negative, gets really small, meaning that the magnitude of the negative size gets bigger. Actually, the optimal numbers here should be positive infinite and negative infinite because they are disjoint. I made it in a way that just illustrates the point. But even at this point, since the training and testing data are really nice, you could stop and test it. Let's kill it. So that's going to be the last weight. And let's see value. So this is the weights after the 100th iteration. You could go more than whatever the iteration. Usually you run a while loop while checking the likelihood, the conditional likelihood. If it stops changing, then at that point you break out of the while loop. But here I didn't have such nice scheme. I just stopped after 100 iterations. And as you see, they could distinguish between spam or ham using that. So once you have the W's, you go through the test data and just plug in the numbers where x appears. So like if CS appears, your CS and the weight of the CS, and divide by the same thing plus 1. And if bigger than half, that's going to be spam, and if it's smaller than half, that's going to be ham. Okay? So when we take a look at what gradient ascent is doing, as we see, more spammy word has to be more positive, and super hammy word should be more negative. How does it work? Let's say we are at the optimal W that classifies everything perfectly. So if the training data, the class label is 1, and your prediction is 1, you are not making any errors. This value is going to be 0. And then meaning you're not going to update the weights anymore. Likewise, if y was 0 and your prediction of y was 1, then this value will be 1 minus 1. And that's 0, and that is 0. And so we are not updating w either here. And so in reality, this is all happening. Like this never happens, like ever. So if class f is 1 and your prediction is like less than 1, let's say this is like less than half. That's really bad. If this is less than half, you're going to say this is class 0, even if you should predict that this should be 1. And 1 minus some number that's smaller than 1 is going to be some positive number. And if you add that number, you increment the numbers that's something positive here, and you're going to add it to the weight, and that makes the w to be bigger. And if you come back here, this number will be bigger because the w, if w is bigger, this value will get bigger than before, and the error rate will get smaller. But this is making w to get more positive here. Can you see that? Yeah. And likewise, we want to make w to be more negative when we see when we make errors. So if y is 0 and our prediction isn't perfect, so less than half, and this is going to be some positive, and since this is 0, that the whole thing will be negative, and the whole sum will be also negative, and that will make w to be smaller. And that's why we are getting the good weights at the end of the gradient ascent. Okay. Okay. So far they look like two different things, but if you throw in another just like simple assumption here, the py, the class, the probability of some class was Bernoulli distribution from the beginning. It was, you could parameterize by some p and 1 minus p for the negative example. And if you assume that the word distribution over the class is Gaussian, it was multinomial in the naive base. And the Gaussian is the generalization of multinomial distribution. That's how Gaussian distribution was came about. So if you make the change, you could do some math, some like algebra, and you will get to this point. Does this look familiar to you? If it wasn't, okay. It wasn't familiar to me either. So you could do some math tricks, and you could show that this is exactly the same as the logistic regression. So if data, the word distribution given some class, was generated from the Gaussian distribution, you can show that the Gaussian, the naive-based classifier and the logistic regression classifier will learn the same thing. But do they actually do the same thing? No, because you don't have the infinite training data. So this is some figure from Ying and Jordan. They compare generative and discriminative model. The generative model here is the naive base, and the discriminative model is the logistic regression. And they claim that if you have lots of data, the logistic regression classifier will perform better. If you have some small number of data, then the naive-based classifier will perform better at the beginning when you have like small data, but as you increase the training data, the logistic regression classifier will do better. So here, the solid line is naive-based, and that dashed line is the logistic regression. As you see, they do better here, and the logistic regression catches up. Sometimes you have too few training data. In that case, the naive base will never catch up. The logistic regression will never catch up, and you see naive base doing better than logistic regression, even though in theory, the logistic regression should catch it up, given you have lots of training data, but usually you don't have like infinite training data. And the number of training data, like how much training data you need to have a perfect classification, depending on like how many parameters your model have. So that depends on the tasks and how you define your features. And yeah, that's all I have today. Any questions? I could go back anywhere you find it confusing. Like any questions about the X project or homework or anything? Okay, then let's wrap it up. Thank you.